Judge Kaufman, he took us live on YouTube, just so you're aware if you had stepped away.
Thank you. I was just warming up my tea, so I appreciate that. Yeah. And Judge Murphy says she's going to have to leave us about 4 o'clock, but we'll get on her phone. Judge Murphy?
Yes, hi.
Ms. Fogle, I'm glad to see you're on here. I didn't think you could join us today.
Yeah.
Right.
What an honor to be here. I do have to leave at 4. I have another pressing conference call. We're trying to locate these 152,000 folks who were signed under the executive order to get their voting rights back. So we have a big call. So
Oh, wow.
I don't know if you all know about the Breakfast Club, Charlemagne the God, and it's 103.9 radio station, but I do something with Reverend William Barber for More Revival, and I'm going to be a guest on the Breakfast Club.
Great.
Oh, neat.
I'm excited.
They showed
When is
up.
that, Tanya?
They're gonna try to call the resident. They'll be there tomorrow morning. They said it was just too active.
Brandon, you're not muted.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's all right.
So the Breakfast Club folks are contacting Reverend Barber's people. And so I think I'm going to pull Clark Williams in on that conversation. And it's about Kentucky. We just had a moral march. It was Moral Monday March on Mitch McConnell and his policies. So not attacking him, but just like we're doing on this call, attacking the policies and things that's hurting marginalized poor people and people of color.
Dr. Price, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon, Mr. Cozart.
Hey, Cozart.
Right, Quinn, let me share the screen, doctor. Thank you, sir. I got you. So we'll call the meeting to order. I hope it's, sorry, I'm just jumping on. Unit was moving slow here. So just so you know, I'm going to do about 10, 15 minutes of housekeeping here and any questions around that. Then we're going to move on in our agenda where Judge Kaufman will facilitate us through some of the substantive components and transition us as well to what is becoming a swift end to a lot of work. So let me read this COVID statement. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, state of emergency and Governor Beshear's executive orders regarding social distancing, this meeting is being held via teleconference pursuant to the Senate Bill 150 as signed by the governor on March 30th, 2020 and Attorney General Opinion 20-05 and in accordance with KRS 61.826 because it's not feasible to offer this primary physical location for the meeting. I want to make certain everybody's aware of that. I want to make certain everyone is aware that is looking at us via live stream on YouTube, which should be up and running. Anyone that wants to send comments can send comments to racial justice at lexingtonky.gov, and we will monitor that and we'll address those issues. And in fact, there's an agenda item around that specifically. And so please, we want the public to continue to participate as they have been doing as well. Just wanted to encourage us as well. This work is heavy. This work may seem heavy, not suggesting that anybody on this committee is intending on quitting. Just want to remind you that the closer we get, the heavier it may get. And so the temptation to quit will be greatest at just about the time that we're about to hit a breakthrough. We're about to succeed. Opposition when pursuing justice Opposition when asking folks to change, in many cases, their systems, their way of living, their privilege, and how they've done things for, in this case, centuries, may be met with opposition. But we will not subside. We will not stop in working on the behalf of justice. So be encouraged, and thank each one of you for what you're doing and continue to do. We have an agenda for today. I also need to make sure that we approve the minutes. And so at this time, I will entertain a motion to approve the minutes from our August 3rd meeting, which you should be in receipt of. Is there a motion?
I'll make a motion.
Motion by Sister Minifield.
Second.
Second by Sister Tana Fogel. Is there any question? No question. All those in favor signify by aye or raising of hand.
Aye.
All opposed, like sign. All right, minutes are approved. Lots of work going on here. And while we know that we have been given the liberty of extending the work by the mayor, we are still keeping with the sentiment that we want to have our recommendations by month's end. And so we need to schedule out our meetings through the end of August. Co-Chair Kaufman and myself have talked. We would like to propose that we keep the same rhythm and cadence of meeting on Mondays, 4 to 5:30, and Thursdays, 3 to 4:30, as our rhythm throughout the end of this month. Is that okay with folks? If it ain't okay, let me know.
I guess we'll need a motion.
We need a
actually.
motion on that, likely, yeah.
Mhm.
Well, that's not asking if it ain't okay. It's not quite Robert's rules, is it?
So
Okay.
moved. So moved.
It is moved that we keep that schedule. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Sister Minifield. Any question? All
I'm
in
sorry,
favor,
David,
signify.
how long did you say to go? These meetings will go until when? Did you say?
Through the end of August. And so the dates on that specifically, we would end on these formal meetings, public meetings on Thursday, August 27th.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, technically,
No, actually the 31st.
yes.
Yeah.
So Monday, August 31st. Thank you, Judge Kaufman. Motion on the floor. Any additional question?
Only one more. We just need to make sure with that our, that we have the capacity to lead these meetings, especially on Thursday. We'll just have to train up someone we have to identify someone in the city to do that. I know that we are good on Mondays, but I think we can vote on this as a committee. And then if we have any issues, I can come back to you.
Okay.
Okay, I'm not sure I understand that. What's the problem with Thursdays?
Council is on break right now, so they'll be coming back from break. So Quinn
So that
and
will
Laura.
We need someone besides Quinn to help us out. We can go ahead and vote on it. They just need to find someone to staff up the meeting.
Right.
Isn't that it, Laura?
Additional question? All those in favor signify by our aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, like sign. Motion carries. We will continue to meet at this rate and rhythm. Thank you all. And we know it's a heavy commitment, but it's a great work. Given that, what are we seeking to do in this time frame? So each one of you have received now what Co-Chair Kaufman and I have received from the super committee chairs of Dr. Smith and Dr. Rosalind Akins, and that is a template that we are to form our recommendations to give to them. They will then synthesize a report for the mayor from the recommendations of all of the subcommittees. So you will have that in your email. Let me say this, Judge Kaufman and myself and the co-chairs, we're doing no violence to their template. we have identified some things that we feel like, in particular, our committee needs to perhaps augment the template with. Specifically, we want to make certain that every recommendation that we set forth not only has the documentation, the quantitative information stating the issue, we want to make certain it not only has the very practical implications of them, we want to make sure it certainly has a recommendation to rectify the issue, but we want to add to that a mechanism by which we're monitoring and holding those respective areas accountable so we can, in a sustained and ongoing way, monitor progress towards the amelioration of these practices that we are finding or have found to be disproportionate, discriminate, or unjust. And so please, as we make our recommendations, please make certain that that is an element as well that we can set forth. Any questions about that in the recommendation format? Because we are swiftly moving into processing this. Okay. We feel like that we would be a bit amiss if we did not have that latter component. And it's embedded in there, and we had the latitude to put it in the conclusion, let me say that. But we want to make sure that each recommendation has metrics and measurements and monitoring mechanisms attached to it. How about that for the first alliteration of the day? So let's make certain we do that, and we know that will happen. On the recommendations, moving forward, as we have met as a subcommittee, out of the lived experiences and the education and the gifts of this committee, there have been people rise up as point persons on the respective recommendations. And Melissa, do you have a question? Okay. Point persons have risen up around each recommendation. And that actually is such a blessing, and it kind of happened organically, but it's very effective, we believe, because each person is either speaking out of their expertise, passion, or gifts. We want to use that organic process to solidify our recommendation, how we're going to form our recommendations. So what we're asking is those respective point persons, in a good way to identify that, if in the case you don't know you've been identified as a point person. Again, the great work of our staff liaison, Laura Hatfield, she has organized a document in our Google Drive that is called Law Enforcement, Justice, and Accountability Tentative Committee Recommendations. You can look at those recommendations that scan from body-worn cameras to LPD conflict mediation to police data to mental health, training, police discipline. If you look at that, it will have the initial recommendation tenet, and it'll also have a lead author. That is who we're considering the point person. And most of you have identified one of those areas, if not everyone, that they want to speak into. So what we're asking is that the point person in that document be the one that individuals email individually to give their to give their input on the recommendation. That point person would form the recommendation and get it to Judge Kaufman and/or myself, or both of us, and we will synthesize all of those. So as we move into the judicial system, we will have more point people rising up, and it's going to happen quick. And we will adopt that same approach to get to our recommendations. We will, of course, vet the final recommendations with the entire committee. We will do that in an efficient way. There's really no way that we can go through every single recommendation during this time. And so we will be vetting those with each one of you individually. Any questions about that process or any suggestions to making this process more effective? we know we want to start processing this wealth of information, getting them down to recommendations is what I say, processing the beef. We want to get the steaks, the T-bones, the ribeyes, the rump roast and all of that and get it all processed and into a form in which we can use it and get it on the table. So to that end, in our recommendations, we're not an island. We're working with other subcommittees. We're also, we can take very seriously being a portal and a voice for the community, for individuals that have done good work in this community that may not be on this commission, for individuals that have been, have experienced some of the injustices that we're seeking to ameliorate, and from individuals that are doing other bodies of work in the community. So we have been very intentional about keeping all of the communique from all of our meetings, from emails that have went to the racial justice at Lex KY, to our most recent town hall meeting. All of those comments with the citizens that sent those, we have in a glossary that each one of this subcommittee has access to. We are charging each individual, the point people and or others that are feeding into any recommendation. They must look at the glossary of questions and comments and concerns of the citizens that we've gotten and make sure that they have been addressed. They may not be in the recommendation in earnest, but everyone must give due diligence to each one of those and make sure that if it's applicable to your recommendation or area, that you are considering that and you're discussing that and that somehow has been addressed in your recommendation. And we will cross-reference our final recommendations to those citizens' comments and questions. So we've gotten individuals that have had several great questions and points. We will take those into consideration. We will not disregard the community and their concerns as we do this work. Yes, ma'am.
David, is there I might have missed this. Is there an end date when you want the recommendations so that we know, so that the citizens know when they need to have their suggestions in, and when we can then look at everything and then submit what we believe to be our final recommendation to the co-chairs here for, dissemination amongst the group? Do we have a date for that so that, we can calendar it?
That's a great catch, Sister Gunther. We need to reverse engineer from the 31st when we want our recommendations formed. So we probably need to back up a week to give out of fairness to our point people in this subcommittee to make sure those things are able to be considered as we're forming the final recommendation. We can't take something on the 31st and we've kind of gotten our recommendation. That doesn't mean that input stops, but to maximize the opportunity for your thoughts and requests and concerns to be considered, could we reverse engineer or back up to Monday, August the 24th, at which time we will have a meeting at 4 p.m. That meeting will be the meeting, I don't want to say a terminal date because it's not a terminal date, but that will be the meeting. The 24th is when we would need that public input to maximize the opportunity of getting that in there.
So the public has until the 24th. So when do the point people?
You gotta have something about the 31st. Yeah, the 31st is the last meeting.
Okay, so we need to have those in by the 31st, before the 31st meeting, so that they can be discussed at the meeting, correct?
Actually, the 31st is the day we have to have the final report in.
Right.
So we're going to have some time to synthesize it. And so I would say that as quickly after the 24th as the point people can finish their recommendations and get them over to Mr. Cozart and me, the better off we are. Don't you think, David?
Well, let's just be explicit about it. Good. This is good discussion. So if the 24th we're meeting, we will come back and have a meeting on Thursday, the 27th. So we could set the 27th as the day and discuss the final product. We're going to be doing some weekend work that weekend, but discuss the final products and do any last modifications on the 31st.
So the 27th for our recommendations to you, and that should include any input from the public that we deem to be applicable to our particular area.
Yes, and that
Okay.
list is up now and running. So clearly you won't wait and don't have to wait for then, but there may be some additional insights coming in, you know, as we continue to meet this month. Any questions about it? Laura, will you make sure those benchmarks are in the minutes? Thank you. Thank you. Any other questions? Okay. So again, as we prepare to pivot from law enforcement, I'm going to hand it over to Judge Kaufman. The last thing I would say, as we're going into Monday's meeting, we will have representation from the FOP presenting to us, and we will have representation from LFUCG's law department that is dealing with the collective bargaining agreement. And so we are again advising for us to look at the June 12th. Laura, give me a head nod. Is that the date of the council meeting when this was discussed? June 12th?
No, Brianna says no.
No. Brianna, when was it?
The 19th.
The 19th.
June 19th. You have a link to that, and I believe Laura has even given us information in dog-eared where in that broadcast our most relevant subject matter around CBA was discussed. So we're strongly advising that everyone take a look at that, because that will give you a great foundation going into our discussions with FOP and LFUCG Law Department as we're looking at the judiciary system. So please, or the CBA, and transitioning a bit to focus on the judiciary system, which I am sure Chief Maynard is ready for us to pivot. So to that end, Judge Kaufman.
Yeah, thank you. And you know, that's a good segue into how I want to begin today. Before we talk about, as promised, what Dr. Potter talked about to us and the DPA, I want to talk about Chief Maynard. And I want to talk about that pivot we're about to make. One thing that, and Mr. Cozart and I've discussed this, one thing that I want to encourage each of us who are guardians of a system to do is to emulate Chief Maynard. He has come into this process knowing that the police department is under fire. He sent us articles about the approach the Lexington Police Department desires to take. And he has given us all the information we need, always cheerfully, I might add. And when he saw a need, he made several recommendations. Several of the recommendations we have on the spreadsheet are indeed from him. And he has done it all openly and with a positive attitude and not defensively. And we appreciate that, Chief. I know it's not hard to be on the hot plate like that. And you've just done that so well. And that's a good guide for all the rest of us who are guardians of a system that we're trying to improve. You have essentially come in and said, you know, we're proud of our police department. We don't want it to be racist. And we want to work with you to make sure we remove any vestige of systemic racism we can identify. So we appreciate that. and let's everyone else, those of you who are in the courts, those of you who are in prosecutor's office, those of you who are defense attorneys, we want you to emulate that approach, if you would. Ms. Baird said at our first meeting that her office has already begun discussing systemic racism. If you have had a survey, if you have actions that you've taken, please be forthcoming with us. We're all on the same mission here. So that's all I would say about that pivot. Now let's turn to substance if we can. And I want to today try to do some grouping of topics and delegation. And a couple of groupings that I've identified that we need some big vision in are, on the one hand, hiring and recruitment, and on the other, training and evaluation of police officers. I would like to ask Diana Queen to be the point person for training and evaluation. Ms. Queen, will you do that?
Yes, ma'am. That'll be fine.
Okay, and I'll come back to more about that in a minute. Dr. Price, I would like for you to be the point person for recruitment and hiring recommendations. Would you mind doing that? Okay, yes, yes, thank you. Okay, Ms. Queen, the one thing I do want your area to include is the paramedicine program. Tuesday night at the town hall, I mentioned generally crisis intervention. And by that, I meant de-escalation policies, paramedicine program, anything else the police department is doing about crisis intervention. A viewer specifically wrote in to talk about the paramedicine program and how well it was working. That is clearly a part of the training, and I would like for that to be addressed as part of your recommendation. Now, you'll find bits and pieces that represent training in some of the recommendations, but I want a bigger picture than that. So as I said, grouping, and I'm counting on Ms. Queen to be the point person. If you have a recommendation you think should be added that goes under hiring and recruitment, please send it to Dr. Price. If you have a recommendation that you think goes under training and evaluation, please send it to Ms. Queen, and we will try to make some cohesive attempt at getting this out there. Now,
Okay.
we already have some point people identified. For example, where are you? Ms. Gunther is the body camera person. And so anything anybody has for her goes to her. Diane Minifield is the person on the citizen input, and anything anybody has should go to her. But we're going to talk about that in a little more detail a little later. Brianna Pursley has taken the lead on general citizen education and involvement. So if you have something on that, it should go to her. Now, I want to turn then generally to some other suggestions that have been made, and I want to start with Dr. Potter. And I'm working from his outline that he sent to us. And one of the things he talked about, and I'll give you the reference, it's on page 3 if you want, is underestimating bias. And he talks about scales that can be used. And one of the things he says, and this is about hiring and recruitment, so that's in Dr. Price's bailiwick, that the MMPI has several scales, I think he said, that can be interpreted. And he says the MMPI should be administered, scored, and interpreted by a professional, preferably a clinical psychologist or psychiatrist who has received special training in MMPI use. I focus on Dr. Potter because he's an expert here. He has watched, probably is watching right now or will watch this meeting later. And he has watched every meeting and has sent us excellent suggestions from the very beginning. We may even have him back at the table, and we may even have him look at our report before we send it in. So we think he's an expert. He I see him on national TV talking about this. And I guess, as Mr. Cozart said, if he's good enough for them, he's good enough for us. He also talked about another scale or another test called the Harvard Implicit Bias Test. You know, I don't know very much about the MMPI or the Harvard Implicit Bias Test, but there are experts who do. And if there are ways to detect bias before officers are ever hired or ever recruited, then that's a good thing to do. Dr. Potter also talked on page 4 about body-worn cameras. And as I said, anything about that can go to Ms. Gunther, and I'm sure she's familiar with what he said here. He also talks about de-escalation and procedural justice. De-escalation, I think, would go under training and those crisis intervention techniques I mentioned earlier. And then the procedural justice component is listening to citizens' views and doing citizen assessments. And he mentions that somewhat later in his report. Moving on through his report, he gives us certain suggestions for research and data collection. And the first one he mentions is 911 calls. His question is, what do Lexington police actually do? And, you know, he had sent to us early, I think the very first email we got was from Dr. Potter after our first meeting. And he gave us a New York Times article, What Do Police Do All Day? It's a very interesting read. And one thing he says is, while not perfect, one way to get an estimate of police activity is through an analysis of 911 calls, the police response to those calls, and the outcome of that response. Judge Scorsoni has also sent some suggestions to Mr. Cozart and me this week. And one of those has also to do with 911 calls. And Judge Scorsoni, I assume you're going to put some of these suggestions in the form of a formal recommendation to the committee?
Well, I'd be glad to. I mean, basically, it'd be something along the lines of Eugene, Oregon's and some of these other communities that have adopted the plans to use non-law enforcement folks to respond to some 911 calls. Yeah.
Yeah. And that if you'll do that and we.
Where does that go? Where does that go?
I don't know. I was just about to say, we can decide later where it's grouped, but I think that goes into the citizen involvement right now off the top of my head. But for now, let's just let it be a standalone recommendation on 911 calls, and we can decide later where it's grouped, if that's okay with you. As far as the analysis of 911 calls, I would put that under a survey category. And I have asked Dr. Price for some information on who academically could do such a survey, and I can talk to her, but I'm happy to be a point person on reports and surveys that we need to have done, unless somebody else is dying to take one of those categories or both of them. Anybody? Okay. All right. I'll put that in my basket. The next thing Dr. Potter talked about was the victimization survey. And I have sent an email to Dr. Price specifically asking about the victimization survey. I'm happy to write the recommendation, but I just need to know about people at UK or in other places who can help us. So Dr. Price, I'll be in touch with you about that. Okay. And Dr. Potter gave us an example of such a study that has been conducted once in Kentucky. And I'll take a look at that and I'll tender this for the committee's review. The next area that Dr. Potter mentioned was a citizen survey asking questions both about crime issues and the police department to assess what citizens think. Once again, I'm happy to put that under the rubric of surveys and write the recommendation, but Dr. Price, I'm going to ask you for your help in identifying the academics
In one of the citizen comments, someone mentioned that the Public Health Department had done something called the Let's Be Safe survey a few years ago. The person I think who made the comment was named Johnson. I don't remember their first name.
It
But
was
is
Larry Johnson.
that,
Okay, I'll take a look at that.
And
And
I can get you those results. I'll reach out and get you those results.
thank you. That would be great. And again, I'm happy to put that under the general heading of surveys that are necessary and write that up in my own recommendation. And then Dr. Potter mentioned a complaint review, and he suggested a review by academic researchers outside the police department of formal and informal complaints. He said because the police department's annual report has reported for each category, we would know going in how many cases we're looking for, would assess types of complaints, would look to see if there are officers with clusters of complaints. He gave, I think he gave the example at this meeting, but if he didn't, he gave it to Mr. Cozart and me when we talked to him. He said that, for example, he had looked just in the newspaper about one officer who on the list of reports we have had 2 complaints, but the newspaper had reported 8. And so somewhere those things need to be reconciled. And again, I'll be glad to put that under the rubric of surveys and see what, or assessments, and see what I can come up with there. And then Dr. Potter also mentioned body cam assessment on page 8 of his report. And Ms. Gunther, he talked about an audit of body cam usage with special attention to the 329 body cam failures in 2019 and such failures in subsequent years. So if you'll take a look at that, Ms. Gunther, as the point person, and just see if you think there's any merit to it. I'm simply bringing this up and putting it on the table for the point people to see whether they think it's appropriate to address. We don't have to do everything he's suggested. He just gave us a good outline. And then moving on, he reflected on our discussions, and it's entitled Appendix 2, Reflections on Subcommittee Discussions. The first is on the Citizens Advocate. I'm going to come back to that. The second is on police training and organization. And Ms. Queen, this is you on police training. I would say you might as well include the idea of organization there as well, Ms. Queen, because when you're thinking about training, you're going to look at how the police department is organized. And of course, you'll talk with Chief Maynard about some of that, because as I said, he has been forthcoming. But if you'll include that in your categories of training, evaluation, and police department organization. Okay. And then Dr. Potter includes a category that is entitled Procedural Justice, Community Policing, and the Guardian Mentality. And my understanding of what Chief Maynard has said is we want to have the guardian mentality, and we're doing what we can. And when he has seen ways, for example, Dr. Potter shared after the meeting, Dr. Potter shared something about the Oklahoma City Police. Chief Maynard read that probably more carefully than any of the rest of us did. And he already has made recommendation about adopting something that he saw in that Oklahoma City police article or outline. I think it would be worthwhile for one person to be the point person on this whole notion of community policing and the guardian mentality. And with all respect, Chief, someone outside the police department. And a lot of that will just involve checking all these categories and seeing if there's anything left over that needs to be addressed. Is there any volunteer for that? Anybody? Judge Isaac, you have it. Okay, you are the point person for making sure that giving us recommendations that will help the police system, the police department, make sure it really does have that guardian mentality it seeks. Okay, Judge Isaac, thank you so much. Now, as promised, and I should say, Dr. Potter also includes a couple of links on pages 9 and 10 of his report about the goals of procedural justice for police being equal treatment, non-discrimination, and non-partisanship. He has a link there. And then he has another link when he talks about Ferguson, Missouri, after the Michael Brown killing by police and the 10 principles of community policing. I looked at that and I found it kind of general, but I think there are other more specific things, Judge Isaac, if you want to go there. So remember, if you have things that you think are not being addressed on this notion of guardian, being a guardian and having that guardian mentality, shoot that to Judge Isaac individually, if you would. Now, as promised, I'm going to move back to citizen complaints. And we said we were going to talk about this today. So, Mr. Cozart, did you say something?
I just wanted to pause real swiftly. As you talked about point persons and went on to categorize, there were a couple of places on the document that is updated, that Laura updated for us from minutes and conversations on August the 4th. It's August 4th revision. So there were LPD, conflict mediation, license plate checks. Did we, which Brandon was the point on, are those going to be separate, or did we identify where those components would be fused to? Would
Well,
they be
you know,
grafted to?
Mr. Dunn, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I would think your recommendation on license plate checks would come under the broad heading of training of police officers, or maybe policies. Is that right?
I would like to see it on the policies.
Okay. Yeah. Well, you know, Judge Scorsoni wrote us this week, and before I shift over to the Citizens Review Board, I should say Judge Scorsoni made some suggestions this week for police policies, and those might all be grouped together. For example, he suggested 1, incidents of de-escalation of violence by officers need to be rewarded and serve as a basis for promotion. 2, failure to de-escalate needs to be deterred and punished. 3, there must be a clear obligation to intervene when an officer is a witness to excessive violence by a fellow officer. And 4, a failure to intervene when excessive violence occurs need to result in severe punishment. He put those under the heading of policies. And maybe we need somebody to be a point person on policies in general.
Well, I think several people of us would say that unless it's policy, there is really no leverage. And so I don't know what doesn't need to be part of policy to some degree. That's my initial thought.
Well, you know, Mr. Dunn, that may be true. I don't know how to group those today. I just saw that Judge Scorsoni grouped these as policies, and maybe it all needs to come under, what is the heading you have instead of excessive force, Chief? I've forgotten it. Resistance or
response to resistance.
Response to resistance, right. So I don't know whether it needs to come under the name of the policy or policies in general. Is policies too general a heading? Probably is, because as Mr. Cozart points out, everything needs to be policy. I do notice, though, in your resistance to force policy, Chief Maynard, that it does not actually say that there is an obligation to intervene, even if the even if the person who is objecting is junior to the one who is committing excessive force. Now, when Mr. Cozart and I talked to Chief Weathers, I understood him to say that in training, you really do impose an obligation to intervene even if you're a new officer, but I didn't see it as part of your written policy.
Yeah, I think that goes without being said, regardless if it's a city officer or junior officer.
Audio's bad, Chief.
You're muffled today, Chief. Well, you know, it may go without being said, but in Minneapolis, when that police officer killed George Floyd, there was a junior officer there who did not intervene. And some of the news analyses have later suggested that maybe he didn't intervene because he's junior. And if it's not written, maybe it's not, maybe it doesn't go without saying. Just a suggestion.
Whatever you think, it could be a policy recommendation.
Yeah, you're still really muffled. I'd say for now, let's leave these in the subject area where they are. Mr. Dunn under the license checks. Judge Scorsone, if you would make your policy recommendations, but one of them under de-escalation, two of them under de-escalation, and two of them under resistance, and then later, if we need to group them, maybe we can do so. Is that okay with everybody? Okay. Judge Corsoni, you also sent to David Cozart and me some hiring and training suggestions. And I thought this was really good about expressing the values and goals. And would you mind shooting that both to Dr. Price for recruitment and hiring and to Ms. Queen for training and evaluation?
Glad to.
Thank you very much. Okay. And then actually, I did have one other area I forgot to mention, and that is that after the DPA, after Mr. Preston from the DPA office was here, I wrote him a note and thanked him for coming. And I referred to the reservations, or I'm sorry, the recommendations he made, which were, as you remember, one, to continue to have conversations like this that were, in his words, open, polite, and respectful. Two, that judges overseeing the system have a duty to inquire whether a charge is the right one. And I implied that he also meant the police officers have a duty to inquire as to whether at every single point in the system, the decision is the correct one or is perhaps imbued with some racist attitude. And then his third one was to narrow the number and range of offenses, which can be felonies, and narrow the effect of a convention and limit the use of PFO charges. And when I reiterated those to him, he wrote back to me and made some suggestions for reports that law enforcement should be issuing quarterly. And I will be happy to put that under the broad category of police reports and try to make a recommendation, but I'm probably going to consult with a couple of you, and I'm mainly thinking about the two of you who have done a lot of research here, Dr. Price and Ms. Queen, on such reports, and also about Chief Maynard, and kind of do my own research and then synthesize those into some ideas for reports that we, the citizens, should be getting on a quarterly basis. So I'm going to include those in my recommendation there. Anything before we move on to Citizens Review Board?
I have something to ask. I don't know if my mic is muted or not.
No,
I'd like to talk to Chief about alternatives to arrest. To see, I know sometimes I think with possession of marijuana, there is discretion to where if it's under a certain amount, You do not have to make that arrest. It could be a citation. Are there any other laws or policies out there or alternatives that we can use to prohibit officers from making arrests that may not need to be made, in a kind of thinking of the thing of arresting yourself out of a situation or trying to arrest our way out of problems within the community? Some things can be done to, have conversations to prohibit officers more so from making that many arrests, to where we could have some alternatives in place. I don't know if there's any such things or anything that the Lexington Police Department is working on or not.
Chief Maynard, do you remember, I know you do, Mr. Preston's list that he said was the DPA's response, and it talked about from the beginning. Mr. Cozart, do you have that handy? You mentioned it at the town hall the other night. Whether you cite or whether you arrest, for example. Do you have any response to that to answer Mr. Dunn's question? Have you given that any thought?
Well, I think a lot of it, hopefully you can hear me better now.
You're better. You're better.
To address Mr. Dunn, we understand that we're not going to arrest ourselves at a lot of the situations. I think there's arrest situations when we have victims that are involved and victims demand, they're calling for us to respond. And a lot of those type of situations are arrestable offense. KRS says with domestic violence, you shall arrest. Outside of those, we do take into consideration of when we have possession of marijuana. It's very rare that we're arrested for that. Some small lower level theft, it's very rare that we're arrested for that. KRS has actually changed. When we're breaking into a vehicle, we catch an individual that's doing that, then we are not going to arrest them. We always work with.
We're losing you at the end. You're getting muffled at the end there.
Hopefully you can hear me following up, but be interested to hear some other avenues of what you think would be offenses that you would like not arrested for. I think we understand that we're not going to arrest our way out of a lot of stuff.
I think that's the attitude a lot of the times for the older, more seasoned cops or officers. Seems like more the younger officers are more gung-ho on making the arrest and wanting to make arrests. So I guess it becomes one of the training aspects. I guess that could go into training, but speaking to yourself, speaking to Chief, speaking to Chief Bastian, those are always some of the first conversations that come up is, we know we can't arrest ourselves out of a problem. But then of course, when you look at sometimes the leadership, it's like, okay, let's implement more officers in certain areas, to patrol, in essence, to make arrests. So, I just, of course, leaning on you all to understand what those policies are, to where we can actually look at those areas to where we could have alternatives for, instead of making arrests. Or some attorneys or prosecutors or someone that actually knows the law. What's up, Miss Madam Ma'am? How you doing?
Hey, I was just gonna jump in with, I'm working on some of those answers for this subcommittee. I know that in Louisville, they have some great alternatives, especially when it's dealing with people who have substance misuse, and their officers take them to the healing place. It's just so many different ways that they don't arrest folks. And I know right over here in the East End, and I even have like a participant, his name is Carl Noel. Everybody knows he's a drunk. And if anybody remembers James Brown, he was even on one of the talk shows of being arrested more than anybody in the country. And so those arrests weren't funny. And for us to know that he has a substance misuse, instead of taking him down to the Fayette County Detention Center, something could have been done. He didn't have to be a statistic or a celebrity in that way. So I'm looking into programs, and I will make a report to this subcommittee. I have other folks in organizations that's helping me compile some of those things so that some folks won't be arrested, especially if you already know their disabilities or their lifestyles or whatever. So I just wanted to jump in there and tell you all that there are alternatives that is floating around Kentucky, and I will try my best to speed up the answers to that.
Ms. Vogel, can you shoot that to Judge Isaac under the notion of the police department really having a guardian mentality? Because that's kind of what you're talking about, isn't it? And Mr. Dunn, isn't that what you're talking about?
I'm not necessarily putting it in that guardianship, but I mean, if that's what it's categorized as, but, you know, I just really want to make sure that, you know, let's lead into after arrest. If we have alternatives to arrest, I know you spoke about Mr. Potter mentioning assessments after somebody's arrested. You know, so if somebody is being arrested every week for petty crimes or every week for alcoholism or some type of drug issue or dependency issue, there seems like there should be an assessment done instead of continuously arresting those individuals, to where we could actually get to the root of the problem so that we don't have to continuously arrest them and they can actually get help and be treated for the issue, for the underlying issue, more so than going back and forth to jail. So what assessments are we doing right now currently once somebody is locked up? I wasn't here when Mr. Potter was here, so I apologize that I wasn't here. But are there assessments being done once somebody is arrested?
That's you, Chief.
Well, not by us. I would say that's more the court system or the detention center. And I will say a lot of the folks that we do have habitual alcoholics or narcotics users, the court system is to get them into those programs. And so arresting them does help with mandatory court orders of you need to go to this treatment, doing programs through the Hope Center, through the court system themselves. So there are the assessments that pre-trial or the court themselves will help with that. But that's beyond my expertise, because once we drop them off at the detention center and Sheriff Witt or there are avenues to go down that road.
So can I just say one more thing before I hop off? So as we're talking about community policing, and normally a drunk or when I was an addict, I did my deal in the same area. So the same cop would see me in that area. So as we build relationships and we become familiarized with the folks that's in a certain sector, central sector, and we have the officers there, they know darn well that this guy is gonna die an alcoholic. So treatment is really not gonna help them. That's like using resources that we should not be using, because this guy treatment is never gonna work, but arrest is never gonna work either. And so people in the community try to help, but what I wanted to say was, as we build relationships and we do this community policing and helping the police folks in the community, that's the fine line that I'm referring to. Why does the officers continue to take them to court? Alcoholics don't go out of their area because they're familiarized with their area, if you all can understand what I'm talking about. So that officer knows, okay, here's this guy. He's drunk again. And so let's take him over here to a safe bed at the Hope Center. And then when he sobers up, then he goes back to wherever he's living, instead of going into the Fayette County Jail and maybe going into DTs because he definitely needs a drink and he's not watched as closely as he should be. So I know the courts does what they do. Fayette County Jail does the best that they can do. but there's a judgment call as the officer standing there. If that person is not tearing up the city or, beating somebody down, then there should be an alternative somewhere in there.
Can I respond to that? You're talking about Henry Earl. See, I was a prosecutor way back when with Judge Tackett, Julia Tackett. Henry Earl was arrested quite a bit, but unfortunately we didn't have available all of these resources that are available now. So police officers would take him to jail for his own safety. And I was a prosecutor when he would beg Julia Tackett not to put him back on the street during the winter because he had no place to go. So we just want to put everything in context. For those of us who remember, Kathy, you remember. So, I mean, unfortunately, we didn't have the Hope Center back then. It wasn't, a lot of resources. So we just want to make sure we put everything in context, that police officers were not arresting Mr. Earl simply because he was being disruptive or anything. It was a lot of times for his own safety.
Right.
And I agree. I agree with Denotra. Can y'all hear me? Yeah. So I agree with Denotra. We didn't have those programs back then when Henry was first getting all of those charges and arrests. But Brandon, to answer your question, our detention center does do assessments and make referrals. Our district court judges do an outstanding job. I have seen them go above and beyond to make referrals to get people into placements. If there's no placements in Fayette County, they work with other communities to get them placed there. Our special treatment courts, and I hope that Judge Murphy will jump in here and talk about the brand new treatment court that she and Judge Thurston are launching. But these mental health courts, veterans treatment courts are doing phenomenal work.
And just as a side, I think first, back to your first point, Mr. Dunn, there are certain charges that, yes, an officer does have discretion to decide whether he's going to cite or whether he's going to arrest. And I think Chief Maynard, and I think he was a little fuzzy, but depending on who's the victim of those crimes, they have to take all of that into consideration about what's going to happen. When we're looking at those petty offenses, as we'd like to call them, as Ms. Fogel said, and Ms. Gunther started her career before me, but I had Henry Earl too. So, I mean, officers would arrest him for his safety. And that is what the charge is. Alcohol intoxication is the person is a danger to themselves and others. And so I think that there also has to be, and this is not necessarily something for us, but I think Mr. Preston discussed, there are some charges that are out there that we may need to address from the KRS level that we need to get rid of. There's too many crimes that are out there that probably need to be addressed, but that's for another day. But I think some of our officers are using what they have as far as resources because there's no place for them to go. As far as our mental health treatment court, until we get them in the court system, we can't find a place for them to go. We don't have we have Eastern State. Eastern State is a revolving door. They drop them off and 5 hours later, they're back outside on the street doing the same thing. And again, they are a danger to themselves and to other people because of their mental illness. And it's not that we're trying to criminalize that, but how do we keep them safe first and foremost? So there's lots of things that I think that the officers are dealing with. And I think we've all hit that. Our officers are not necessarily social workers. So how do we address all of those things?
Well,
yes, go ahead.
No,
I'm sorry,
I think the answer is you don't necessarily send a law enforcement officer from the get-go.
Right.
And if what Eugene, Oregon's found out, out of 2,400 cases that they sent a social worker or a healthcare professional there, in only 150 cases out of 2,400 did they have to call for backup from a police officer. So they were able to either diffuse the situation or triage it into, some social service agency or something. So the key to try to avoid people getting arrested is maybe send people out there,
right,
without arrest powers and see whether they can figure out a better way to resolve the emergency, I think.
Good question. So this is all that, you mentioned we didn't have these opportunities now, but do we have a sobering center as part of our detention facilities in Fayette County?
No.
I don't think so.
All we have is what we would call, I guess, is our drunk tank. is they take them to the jail where they sober up, and then they can administratively release them after a few hours. But we don't have a center outside of the detention center. Do we, Sheriff Witt? Am I?
I do have a medical infirmary at the Community Corrections Center. I'm not sure how many individuals they can house at one time, but they do treat a lot of different things in that infirmary.
But
If I
but
could
they
step
do.
in here just for a moment, I'm sorry for interrupting, but I think that Judge Isaac has heard a lot of things about community policing and guardian mentality and coordination with the Hope Center. And do we send a police officer or a social worker that will feed into her area? I think Ms. Queen has also heard a lot of things that go into training, such as the discretion to cite or to arrest. And maybe some of the rest of you in your area, and also that sobering center, Judge Isaac, that Dr. Price mentioned. Maybe you could ask her for more information about that. I think this has been a really good discussion, but I want to call a halt to it and swing to another topic now. And it's over to you, Ms. Minifield, and that is the Citizens Review Board. And the only reason I do that is that it's such an important topic, partly because it's in the news everywhere, and it's also something that's been asked for by some citizens groups. We've seen the Black faith leaders talk about it. We've seen the NAACP statement. I think LPD Accountability talks about it. I'm not sure where else, but Dr. Potter mentioned citizen involvement, and Ms. Minifield put a recommendation on the table. And I'd like for us, it's 4:06. I'd like for us to spend the rest of our time, pretty much all of it, talking about Citizens Review Board. Let me tee up a few issues. I did this kind of at the end last time. One, I wanted to know how specific we need to get. And I asked Councilwoman Masadi, who is involved in other things today, to address how specific do we need to be for this to be successful. And she jumped in as specific as possible, so it doesn't gather dust on a shelf. So there's that answer. The other thing, though, I remember, Ms. Minifield, when you talked about this, you mentioned Citizens Review Boards have met with mixed success, mixed records. Dr. Potter said the same thing. Ms. Queen, in an email to Mr. Cozart and me, or maybe in the article she sent, articles, I should say, showed that it has a checkered history in Louisville, and there are varying degrees of success in various places. And then this week, Judge Murphy sent out to the committee some substantive suggestions for you, Ms. Minifield, for this recommendation, things that could be done to tweak it right now. And so I'd like for us to talk about that. And I suggested to Judge Murphy that she bring that up today. So you want to, and then today or last night, Ms. Minifield, I think we got a revised version from you, didn't we? Okay. So Judge Murphy, you want to tee us up there?
I can, and I've actually had an opportunity to chat with Ms. Minifield. And so one of the discussion points, just as I think that we have discussed, and I think Dr. Price and Ms. Minifield hit it probably our second meeting in when we were talking about disciplinary review board. Brianna was looking at it, or Ms. Persley was looking at it from the vantage point of how we get our citizens educated on how to file a complaint. Ms. Minifield was looking at, the investigation to see if we make sure that it's not the police investigating the police. So right now, as we have it, our disciplinary review board, or that panel that gives a recommendation to the chief after the chief has met with them and he has turned it down, or he or she has turned down the offer, that review board is set by the CBA. That panel is decided, who's a member of that is decided by the CBA. So I spoke with Ms. Minifield about potentially we change that demographics of that panel and we make it not just police officers, that we have, the chief has his cohort of folks. So there's assistant chiefs and commander level there. I know the FOP has their representative, but we go ahead and we insert 2 to 3 citizens, not just one, because I think one would be overrun. I think 3 citizens to balance it out early on, because I think our first and foremost is that we are trying to get citizens in on every level of this process early on. So if we had citizens on that review board, and that can be changed from the CBA level, not from KRS. I think Dr. Price pointed out, it's not the gag order is that particular citizen would be given an oath of confidentiality, and they can't make public statements, but they could be there on that review board. If so, and I've talked over this with Ms. Minifield, and she's kind of echoed, and because she's done a deep dive, and these are conversations that I've had with going back to my former days, talking to Mr. Horn to make sure I understand it correctly. And that was going to be how I think that we need to add to what we have. So Diane, I'm done talking now.
Okay. Well, I think that I sent a revised late this afternoon, probably around 1:30 or 2 o'clock, that incorporated Melissa's statements right there regarding that disciplinary review board. But if you go through the revision I sent 2 days ago, where it goes with the immediate recommendations, basically it talks about 1 and 2 are about the process, the publication of some disciplinary dispositions. And because it says that you cannot talk about anything with that gag order unless, of course, it's reached a dispositional stage. And so I put in there something about how to publicize once they get to dispositional stage. And that is, the website, newspaper, or whatever. And then number 2 was to acknowledge the existence of a discipline procedure. Those 2 items, 1 and 2, dealing with that KRS gag mentality, the gag order that kind of cloaks and confidentiality, that process. Then we get to 3, when it talks about the mayor appointing and swearing in individuals with an investigative duties and responsibilities regarding the discipline complaints against officer. That jumps directly into the police officer system now has the public integrity unit, which is the internal affairs, used to be called internal affairs, now it's public integrity unit. So it's a group of 3 police officers that are assigned under the statute and the collective bargaining agreement to investigate complaints made against a police officer. So it doesn't indicate that they have to be, that they can't, that's the only entity that can do that. It does say in the statute or KBA that it has to be a sworn law enforcement agency. So that's when we decided to, don't tell me what we can't do, tell me what we can do. So how do we get other sworn law enforcement? What does that definition look like? That's just somebody that's that can be sworn by the mayor, because there's several sworn officers. I mean, there's, University of Kentucky police, airport police, there is hospital police, there are inspector generals for the post office, so there's lots of sworn law enforcement officers. So the mayor can swear in what I've called a inspector general or some sort of citizen review group, and give them that swearing powers, and then they will be charged with the same duties and responsibilities right now that is being held by the public integrity unit. And we're not saying that take that duty and responsibility away from the public integrity unit, but just allow that new sworn panel to be able to be citizen run, and be able to be to give their findings, because I believe that if we don't get citizens' involvement at the investigative stage of a complaint, we're going to end up being a rubber stamp as to what the public integrity unit finds, because what they're going to present is what they bring to the table. So if we don't get a citizens group involved at the investigative level of a complaint, we almost defeat our purpose. So if we put this investigative group together at the initial start of when a complaint is made against a police officer, and swear them in, give them a name, give them a title, and allow them to have the subpoena powers, to collect the necessary evidence and information to make a reasonable, rational decision to be presented to the chief. Because according to the collective bargaining unit, that's where it goes to. It goes from the public integrity unit to the chief. So it will go from our independent citizen group to the chief. And then the chief then has to make a decision. They may be identical. Both of those findings may be identical. And he just then contacts the officer that's been charged and move forward to disposition or make him a recommendation. Then it becomes the rights of the officer to decide whether he accepts what the chief, imposes. And then if not, then it goes to a police review committee. And then after that, which is where Melissa comes in at and says that on that committee, she would like to see citizens on that. Right now, it's a committee of 6. And I want to say they've got assistant chiefs, commanders, and sergeants, and then, one FOP person. And that is statutorily defined. That Pacific board is statutorily defined in the KBA. But her recommendation is to seek amendment to that KBA. So that group now can have at least 2 or 3 citizens on it. But that's going to require an amendment to that collective bargaining agreement, because
Can
that's
I
what.
interrupt real quick, Diane? Not statutorily, but just in the CBA. So we would not have to go to the legislature.
Not the legislator. She's right. It's just the CBA agreement. So that agreement would have to be amended in order for that to occur. And this is the right time for it, because of course the current agreement expires in October. So while the negotiations are going on, that be included as I want to say mid-level type of recommendation, because that has to get something changed. The first recommendation with this inspector general type of group does not require any changing of the Kentucky Revised Statute, nor does it require a changing of the collective bargaining agreement. It only requires the mayor swearing in individuals. And so then it gets to, who are these individuals going to be? There were questions about that group of 3, or whatever the number is going to be. Who are they going to be? We want them to be informed people. We want them to have some sort, and I asked that to Dr. Potter, and he indicated that they should be somebody with some law enforcement background. Somebody that maybe have gone
law
through
enforcement background, Diane, or law enforcement savvy, law enforcement understanding?
Well,
there's a difference.
His definition was law enforcement background, maybe gone through his program at EKU or whatever. And he said, because not all of those people that go through that end up on the police force. Some end up in social work, some end up, in hospitals. And so just have some working understanding, however it is, obtained, of law enforcement and social work. So that's put into the list as well, that maybe they have some social work background, maybe they have some communication background, maybe they have some, and in order for the public to feel as though we didn't just create another rubber stamp group, another public integrity unit, just now calling them a citizens group with, so I suggested that maybe they be 1 from each council district. And Ms. Queen and I talked about an application process, that the people fill out an application process who have an interest in that, and want to do that as a citizen with a civic minded duty. And 1 application, and 1 individual selected from each 12 council district. And then that body of 12, that is going to be our quote inspector general, sworn in by the mayor for investigative purposes. When they do get a complaint, I know 12 trying to reach a decision is probably not going to happen. And like with the Court of Appeals or with, they do them in panels. So you have a 3 panel from that 12, but one of those 3 has to be from the community or the district that the complaint is from. So if it's a 6, congressional district or, district, then that has to be a person from that district of the 3 that's assigned to investigate that particular incident or that particular allegation of misconduct. So it doesn't be the whole 12 at each time. It's 3 at each point per allegation. And then they make their investigation and indicated the subpoena power. Me and Judge Corsoni talked about how does that even look and how does that even happen? But from my understanding and talking with Ms. Beard is that right now the Public Integrity Unit, if they want some information, they have the ability to ask the Commonwealth Attorney's Office for a subpoena, and then that Commonwealth Attorney's Office will go to the sitting grand jury and ask for a subpoena to be issued and those records obtained. So there's no reason why this group couldn't have that same process to go to the Commonwealth Attorney and ask for them to ask the grand jury to issue a subpoena to get those records that they're trying to get, or at least go to a circuit judge, maybe through the law department. But some kind of way, they've got to have the ability to gain the information that group does. And I think we can get that to them. And once they get that information, of course, like I said, it's presented to the chief. And then the question becomes, well, what if the chief doesn't do anything with it? You know, I mean, what if the chief gets that information from that citizens group, as well as his information from his Public Integrity Unit, and then he ignores it or he doesn't do anything with it? What are the ramifications? How do you address that? But at that point, he's got to be able to make some disposition. If that disposition at that level is made, then it's going to become public. And so if that disposition is not made at that level, then of course it goes down the line to that disciplinary review board. And that's simply because the officer didn't accept what the chief's recommendation was. And so, so then it gets to another group that has a couple citizens on it, and or either it gets disposed of and then it gets publicized, because at that point, the gag order is lifted once the disposition is made. And so at some point, if we've got a chief that's not responsive to either of these findings made by these two different groups, then of course, you know, that's a voting issue. I mean, that's a decision that's made at the point when, you know, they've got problems with the chief, and that's a mayor's, you know, appointment, and it goes from there, but it's at least publicized. So, I mean, and I know at some point, this group of 12 that's going to break off to 3 when they receive a complaint, it's going to have a lot of work. I mean, if you look at it though, but when I look at the numbers, and Chief Maynard submitted the numbers for what we had in informal complaints in 2018 was 69, in 2019 was 96, and right now we sit in 2020 at 63. And then formal complaints in 2018 was 2, and then in 2019 was 8, and right now we sit at 5. And that's just for, we're talking external complaints. We're not talking internal complaints. We're not asking our citizens group of 12 broken down to 3 to investigate police on police complaints. We're asking them to investigate citizen on police complaint. So if a police officer is making a complaint against another police officer, then it will continue to go through their normal process. But if it's a citizen alleging a misconduct or a complaint, then it will go through the new group. Yeah, Ms. Queen.
Can I ask you a question?
Okay, wait a minute. Ms. Queen is asking.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Diana.
That's okay. That's okay. I just wanted to, just on that one, I mean, I have, you know, there's a lot of things rolling through my head here, so I'm gonna, you know, I'll refrain from all that. But on the issue of complaints, you know, and looking at what is currently offered, you know, and respect that number. But in response to that, I would say that when a citizens review panel is implemented, I think it would be probably expected that those numbers will rise.
And I put that in there as well, because at this point, I assume that that group is going to need some paid staff, you know, to help sort through. And so right now, the recommendation is that with the numbers where they stand now, there should be somebody assigned from the mayor's office that could assist that panel of 3, you know, Inspector General group, to help with collection of the evidence and getting all the information and be the working force for that group. But if the process increases, like I hope it will increase, you know, and that's not my, Brianna is the one that's dealing with that citizen advocate, pre-complaint that makes sure that the citizens understand that they can file a complaint and someone assisting them in filing a complaint, that yes, I believe those numbers are going to go up when we get somebody on that pre-side helping citizens do that. And once that happens and those numbers do justify the need for a full-time person employed, in the mayor's office to help this panel, then I think that is where that's going to come in at. But right now because I'm looking at this as an immediate recommendation, that this panel is volunteer, but it's done through an application process and it's done through a, with some background and able to do it. And, but then that they have a hard staff. And at some point down the line, it may be a paid panel. And I put it in the recommendation, like I did hearings for the Human Rights Commission. I didn't get paid until I was actually adjudicating a hearing. So hearing officers that's assigned. So those 3 panelists, when they actually have a complaint that they're investigating and doing, it may be some opportunity to give them a stipend, for the work.
Mr. Minifield, can I break in real swiftly? And then I want to make sure we want to make sure Sister Gunther gets in. I just, as a commentary, not as if there is not a great deal of work that you and others have done and will continue to do. But I wanted to make sure that highlighted this is opportunity also. I'm looking at our citizens' comments. A lot of them are going to be around the Citizens Review Board. So this is a great opportunity to cross-reference, and what we're addressing is addressing many of those things. But I know there are comments from Alicia Patara, Jack Taylor, April Taylor. Also, it's opportunity for us to look at, to make sure that we're seeking to do collective alignment with some of the other folks looking at CBAs or Citizens Review Panel sort of notion. So just wanted to inject that. Sister Gunther or co-chair.
Judge Kaufman.
Yeah, no, Ms. Gunther, just this. We are 4 minutes away from the end of our meeting. So if you'll just summarize, and then I just have 30 seconds to say.
I have 2 questions, and they don't have to be answered now, but just first of all, if you're going to have an application process for those citizens from each district, who then selects them? That's going to be important, because
I would assume it's the council person from that district that will choose that representative for that district.
Okay, if you believe that that's the most appropriate thing, there may be some issues regarding that. And then my other question is, it may be to Chief Maynard, who exactly negotiates the CBA with the FOP? Who exactly sits on that? Who's doing that?
You know what? That's a great question for Monday. And Ms. Gunther, thank you for teeing that up for me, because that's where I was going. Gosh, that Saturday night, Ms. Minifield sent us all this recommendation. It just represented so much good work and was so meaty and so detailed, but it's getting more and more and more streamlined every time you think it through even further. So Ms. Minifield, thank you for all this good work, and to everybody who has asked questions and made additions and made suggestions. I just request a couple of things. One, Ms. Minifield, I can see you making notes and thinking things through as we talk today. But on Monday, Ms. Minifield, I don't see any reason you shouldn't run this by the FOP. That person's part of the system too. And that is a system that needs to be concerned with its own systemic racism. And so the citizens seem to think this is a great way to address systemic racism. And so I don't see any reason you shouldn't outline this and talk about whether this can happen. Ms. Gunther, I think that question about who sits down and negotiates this and who's going to be looking at it, and are you going to do something like this, or are you going to demand something in return, are good questions. Ms. Queen, I think another thing that needs to be considered now is this. What about your recommendation that's on the table? And I actually teed it up and took a picture of it. And the bottom line on your recommendation is creation of an ad hoc voluntary exploratory committee comprised of community members with special emphasis on members from the Black, Brown, African American, Latino, and international communities to study in depth varying civilian oversight mechanisms and models, and recommend a best fit for the needs of the Lexington community. One question I have is, can these two recommendations stand together? I think they probably can, because right now we're looking at what is the most specific and best approach we think can work here, but do we need a longer term study? And so I just offer all of those ideas to all of you. Let's be ready for Monday. Please remember that you have homework to do, and let's do be prepared for the people who are coming from the FOP and the law department, and ask them good questions. But this Citizens Review Board has to be on the table when they're in the room with us. Everybody, golly, thank you for a great meeting. I'll see you Monday. Remember, on Monday, it's not at 3, it's at 4 o'clock, 4 to 5:30. And continue to talk to each other individually about all these things. Thank you to everybody who agreed to be a point person. I'm sorry if I railroaded some of you into it, but you know, sometimes that has to happen. Okay. Bye, everybody.
Bye, Judge.
Bye.